Good day, guys, Austin here, and in this one today we're going to be taking a close look at emulation. Now, 2017 has probably been one of the biggest golden ages of emulations I have ever seen. I mean, things are hitting the block now that I've never seen before, ever. I mean, obviously, because we're now emulating current gen systems which have never even thought about emulating. Not only are they emulating them, but they're far surpassing those systems which they emulate in the first place. So in other words, you get a more enhanced experience playing them on the emulator than what you did on the original console. Now, I'm not just talking about new gen stuff, I'm talking about old gen stuff, older systems, new systems. But to be honest, there's so many emulators out there to choose from. Which ones do you use and why? Well, I'm going to bring to you now my top 10 of what I use, what I think are the best ones out there right now, and how they are impacting and what exactly they can do. So enough of my waffles, this one's going to be a long one, so without further ado, let's get stuck in. Number 10, and this one's a new intro for this one. Last year it was only in the upcoming emulator scene and I was anticipating this to break through, and boy oh boy did it. We are now introducing Citra into this top 10. Citra is an awesome emulator to Nintendo 3DS. It allows us to play those handheld classics on our PCs. In fact, it allows us to play on Macs, Linux and Windows. Now, it is absolutely gobsmacking the breakthroughs that the team have made over there. It's completely open source, anybody can work on it, and it's been around for a few years, but in the last 12 months, Jesus, this emulator has exploded with growth. Things are now not just playable, but they are now enhanced. They are a lot more, I don't know, better looking, better experienced than on the actual handheld itself. Don't get me wrong, this is still very much work in progress. There is a lot of games that won't even boot, but for the majority of the games that do boot, this really it ramps it up to another level. If it had more compatibility with a lot more of the games, it would score a lot more higher. But this is still very much work in progress. The Citra team, which of course is literally everyone around the world because it's open source, have brought so many things into this during this short period of time of the 12 months, which has brought it to the level that we see it today. A lot of the Mario games are playing, a lot of the classics, Pokemons. You can enjoy these to a top-notch experience which has never been seen before. You can play a lot of your Pokemon games which were previously only available on handheld devices and now play them on Windows machines, and of course Mac, and of course Linux. It is outstanding how they've managed to transfer this through all different operating systems. Now, of course, this has been done, I would say, because of the big breakthroughs and the public attention it got from those Chinese builds, whether it be for the better or the worse. They're not no special thing that some guy magically developed one day. Because this is open source, everybody develops on it. Everybody has branches, everybody has new ideas, everybody develops different things, and it all gets amalgamated into the official builds which we see today. Now, during that period, the official build was taking a lot of time for it to come from people making the ideas into actually bringing them to fruition within the official builds. Sometimes up to about 6 months. So it was always playing catch up with what was available out there. Now, what these Chinese builds did, and the unofficial ones, and the ones that people were making and naming them all kinds of stuff, was they were taking little snippets, little groundbreaking ideas that people were working on, and they were just throwing them into builds. Now, this is amazing. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad thing, but you've got to take into consideration it may work amazing on one game. It may work amazing on a handful of games. But when you're trying to emulate for a system which is into the thousands, then you've got to think of the knock-on effect of bringing that into fruition onto the official build and how it could impact. It could be, I don't know, 2 big steps forward but 10 huge steps backwards in terms of the progression of the emulator in general. So what they decided to do was they've now made it so you've got 2 builds that are available to everybody officially on their website. You've got the nightly builds, which is kind of like the official ones were back in the day, where everything that's been in there has been tested, it's been proven, and it's probably 90% official in what what they want, and it's got the stamp of approval saying, yeah, we will stand by this build. Anything that happens in here, tell us about it, and we'll do our best to rectify it in the future. What they've also got is the bleeding edge builds. Now, these are what you would call, I don't know, the custom builds which people are bringing out. Basically, it's taking the best of the bunch, the brightest ideas, what is available out there, putting them into a build and seeing how it flies. Now, the great thing about this is making it kind of official is that you got a lot more testers. People can just grab these and are able to emulate all those games on their system, and then they can give feedback. But it gives them an idea of what's working, what's not, and it gives them, you know, a lot of feedback in general as to what's going on. So it's a win-win situation for everybody. You've got the official ones, which is kind of the nightly builds, and you've got the highly experimental ones, which is the bleeding edge. Sometimes they're closer to each other in terms of performance and what you can get out of them, but sometimes you will get a lot more performance and features in some scenarios out of the bleeding edge. And the introduction of the sound, the speed, the resolution being ramped up. There's only a few things that I'd like to be added to this one. And if this had more compatibility with more games, this would get a lot more higher in this list. But as of yet, it is only just broken into what I would say the working emulator, where I would actually choose this to play games and enjoy them to the full potential. But it is very much there. So thank you to the Citra team for everything you've done. You've made a gobsmacking number 10. So this now brings us on to number 9. And this emulator I'm choosing not because it's the best emulator. But in fact, if it was the best emulator, it'd be number 1. But I'm choosing this because it's the best emulator for me playing one of my favorite systems of all time. That is the Dreamcast, the Sega Dreamcast, and that is Demul. Now, last year when I released the top 10, I chose null DC, and it's still a very valid option. It is less system intensive, it doesn't have such an impact on your hardware, so if you've got a lesser, I don't know, clock system, or you've got an older system or something like that, you probably get more joy still playing out a null DC. But for those of you who have got a, well, even a half decent one by today's standard, then you should have no issues whatsoever playing this, even at native. They really did pick up the ball. Null DC hadn't been touched in some time. The system kind of was stagnating, and we were just left with what we had, the scraps of emulation. But the Demul team, they really did pick up the ball. They've now made it the most highly compatible, the most accurate. It can play Windows CE games, something that many of the other emulators cannot do. This is the games that loaded up and they had the little logo at the beginning. For some reason, other emulators just don't play ball with this. But not only that, it also allowed us to play the arcade versions of the games. So we had Naomi boards 1 and 2, Autonomous Wave, Vicaru, Super H, Power VR, many of the arcade versions of the games, or even the arcade games in general, ones that weren't even ported over to the console, are now playable using this emulator. But not only that, I'm blowing some trumpets now, and not only that, it actually heightens the experience a hell of a lot more than what null DC can do. The resolution changes can really impact the way these games are being brought to you, especially the more 3D based ones. You've also got post-processing effects, so you can add extra filters and things like that on top. Then you've got the actual compatibility stuff that's going on. The way that it encompasses different APIs, there's so many different options that are available using Demul than what isn't available using null DC. But the biggest caveat to all this is the compatibility. Although it is the most compatible out of all the emulators out there, you still need all the different emulators to run all the different games. That's because it's like Nintendo 64. There is no one emulator to rule them all. Depending on what games you want to play, depends on what emulator you want to be running. Now, like I said, Demul is the most compatible. So 9 times out of 10, especially if they're with the most popular games, you should have no issues with that whatsoever. But of course, you will need one of the other emulators if you want to play the entire catalogue. And there is quite a few, some of them pretty bad, some of them okay. I mean, null DC is the other valid option. Then you got Raycast, which is the new version of null DC, but it's more of a port to Android and kind of broke more than it actually fixed. So it's kind of 2 steps forward, 5 steps backward. And that one hasn't been picked up in a short while anyway. So then you've got Macron, Chancast, LX Dream, then you've got Redream, Washington DC. The list goes on. There is a hell of a lot of stuff, but the most compatible, the best one out there, and the one that I would choose to play my Dreamcast, and of course, as a bonus, all the arcade variations of it, Demul. Demul all day. They've done an awesome job. I just hope that they pick up that ball again. The last official release is in late 2016, which is awesome. Any kind of release is awesome to me. In the meantime, there has been a few actual enhancements that's been brought out by the fan scene itself. Some games have had some enhancements, especially in terms of hacking into them. So now you can use Demul to use the widescreen hacks. Shenmue looks absolutely beautiful when blown up to the widescreen. I'm not just talking about stretching, I'm talking about using native resolution to fill those black bars so it kind of renders the entire screen rather than just a square. Also, the resolution, like we talked about, the extra filters on top of it, it makes Shenmue one of my most beloved games look absolutely beautiful, almost to current gen standard when using the kind of hacks and slashes that people have brought in to get the most out of its games and this emulator in general. So thank you very much to the Demul team. Thank you for everything that you have done. I hope that you do pick up the ball again, but even if you don't, hats off and thank you very much. Number 8, and this one goes against everything that I want to say. This emulator gets in there for how good the actual emulator is rather than the system itself. Well, to be honest, the system was awesome anyway. I am choosing UAE. Now, this is the unusable Amiga emulator. Now, it is very much usable, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But this emulates, obviously, Amiga games. And it doesn't just play them on our PCs. It can literally play your Amiga catalog on anything. And literally anything. I'm talking about Linux, Mac, DOS, Windows like we talked about, RISC, Android, Xboxes, PSP, PSP Vita, iOS, Wii, Dreamcast. I can even play Amiga games on my watch with this emulator. That is how advanced, how many people have got stuck into this, and how far they have taken the emulation for this. And it is all thanks to the UAE emulator starting this all back off in 1995. That is decades ago. That is how long this emulator has been in development, and it really shows. When it comes to actually playing the games, of course, they're not much different. I mean, taking a version of it playing the game now and comparing it to even 10 years ago, there is virtually no difference whatsoever. You're going to get the exact same speed, graphics. You've probably got a new few filters, a few little tweaks that you can do here and there. But in terms of gameplay experience, it's nigh on perfect. What they do, however, is they really push it forward in terms of bringing this onto new platforms like we just talked about, increasing the compatibility in terms of controls, really nailing down what can be played, how you can play it, kind of enhancements that can be done to streamline you just enjoying the games in general. That is what made this emulator so unique. It has brought in so many things. It's got such a fan base that people from all around the world, in all walks of life, in all kinds of loves for different systems and emulators, still work on this for today. I mean, that new games are released daily. I mean, even though the game catalog is in its thousands, and I mean thousands and thousands, games are still being found that were never released from back in the day. People were working on Amiga games in the bedrooms, and some of the games are pretty damn good. And the games that were AAA budget, or what you could class them as back then, they are still holding up to today's kind of gameplay. It was mind-boggling. I myself am painful saying this because back then I was a PC lover. I had a PC 286 working on DOS. I had Windows 3.1 back then or something, and I was playing games like Monkey Island and, well, you know, the point and clicks that everybody remembers from back then, and I loved it. But when my mate got an Amiga across the road and I went over there and I seen the catalogue that he had, the games that were just playable straight off the disc, no messing, it was like, oh my god, this is my love. Why do I have a PC? And I was so envious of him. But looking back now, being able to play these on absolutely anything, it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and it's a testament to how the emulation scenes and how it works so well. This is how emulation should be done, for the love, for the games and for the actual people who play them in general. I love everything about it. Now, this emulator is completely free. It is ready downloaded on all the platforms like we've already covered. However, in order to get the full potential out of it and to be able to play every game, what you're going to need to do is actually donate. Now, this is one of the few occasions which, of course, you can go online, you can get sneaky downloads from all kinds of places, but this is one of the few occasions where I would encourage you guys to actually donate and purchase them officially. Now, this team who enables us to do it all is called Amiga Forever. I'll put links in the description down below where you can purchase these Kickstarter ROMs, and purchasing these are once and you get them forever. It's Amiga Forever. And this doesn't just sort them out and let them, I don't know, put their feet up and do nothing. These guys are constantly developing. The reasons why we're able to get this on so many different platforms with so many different operating systems, emulated on so many different sets of hardware, is because of the amount of work that these guys do. So that few bucks have contributing towards them. This enables us to get to where we are today, and why it's in my top 10. Of course, me being a ZX Spectrum and a, I don't know, PC fanboy, of course, it pains me to say that Amiga emulator kind of wins me out on the computer emulation side of things. But there you go, that's number 8. So this brings us on to number 7, and this one is another newcomer. This one's been around for some time though. In fact, this one is probably one of the oldest. No, in fact, no, it's not. You will see some of the oldest in just a short while. But this one has been around since probably emulators came about. Now, this one was called Ninsa or Nintensa or something like that from what I remember, top of my head there. But now it is called MEDNAFEN, which, although be it a strange name, is what they decided. Apparently it stands for My Emulator Doesn't Need a Freaking Excellent Name, which, to be honest, is kind of cool. This emulator is an awesome choice for many of the systems which it does emulate, and by God does it emulate many systems. We're talking about Lynx, Neo Geo Pocket, WonderSwan, Game Boy Advance, NES, SNES, Virtual Boy, PC Engine, TurboGrafx 16, SuperGrafx, Game Gear, Genesis, Mega Drive, Master System, Saturn, Sony PlayStation, so on and so forth. This is a hub of gamey goodness, and it plays a hell of a lot of games, and it plays a hell of a lot of them very well. The main emphasis of this emulator has always been high quality, high compatibility, and high accuracy when playing the games. It's maybe not have many of the bells and whistles what some of the other emulators have, but what it does do, it does it damn well. If you want to play one of the games from one of those systems that it does, it will do it damn well, especially to the kind of standards of what it was back in the day. Very few of the systems have many glitches, and it's just an all-round, all-good emulator. But yeah, MEDNAFEN, I've chosen this because, not because it plays all these systems, and especially not because it played all these systems for this amount of time. I chose it because it's currently playing Saturn like Saturn's never been played before. Saturn is, again, as we talked about with all the previous emulators, it's a problem system. There isn't one emulator to rule them all. You're not going to get every game running to its full potential with all the bells and whistles. It's just the way it is. It's the way emulation has always been. Now, beforehand, the times gone past, we have always used either Yabuse or Yabaus, I'm not sure how you pronounce that one, or we've used SFF, Sega Saturn emulator, basically. And yes, it was good. Yes, we played many of our games that we loved, and it has been the choice of mine for many years. In fact, I think I chose that one on my last top 10. But now, as of this last 12 months, MEDNAFEN blown off the doors, bringing us a core for the Sega Saturn. And this one is the most compatible, it's got the most options, and for me, is the one that I would choose to emulate the Sega Saturn. Me, a big fanboy of Sega, especially the Sega Saturn, a forgotten system that doesn't seem to have the much appreciation, especially for some of the big games and the big titles that were released on there. It seems to have been forgotten. So having this emulator bring that kind of compatibility and bring these games back to life, which hadn't been done before with more recent emulators, well, that's good things, and that's why this has been brought in to where it is. It's an awesome emulator in general, but blowing the doors off the Sega Saturn emulation, that's why it gets into this year's top 10. So thank you very much, MEDNAFEN, and everybody involved in it. You've done an awesome job as always. Number 6, and this one has got no change, to be honest, and there's no need to change because it's still a gem of an emulator. Now, the only reason why this didn't get any further is because of the stiff competition it's got in front of it. Trust me guys, you'll realise why. But this one is PlayStation 2 emulation at its best. In fact, it's pretty much masterpiece stuff in emulation altogether. This is PCSX2. Now, what this emulates is obviously, like I talked about, the PlayStation 2. There is other emulators out there, such as Play, but they're still very much in their infancy. Hopefully, they'll catch up with this, but there's still a long way to go for that one. And, well, hats off to it. I hope it does. Competition is always good. But for now, we've got PCSX2, and it's been out for a while. This was released back in 2002, which means, at the time of me making this video, it's been out for over 15 years. That's flew by. But it's good. Now, the developers that were working on PlayStation 1 emulation, they decided to have a dabble at the PlayStation 2, see how far they could get. And in 2002, they managed to get the PlayStation 2 to boot, and which kind of opened a can of worms. It was then released back in 2006, which kind of like the official release, albeit on a very slow emulation. And I mean very slow. Games were very glitchy, not much was working, and what was working pretty damn badly. But when you consider the hardware that was in the original PlayStation 2, it was groundbreaking. It really was. It was a multi-core console. That kind of stuff hadn't been even brought out in PCs back then properly, at least into the mainstream. So having that kind of stuff going on, then trying to emulate it at that early stage, you ain't going to get much joy. But obviously they plugged away at it, things progressed, and well, it's coming to fruition as it is today. Now, it is a beast of an emulator. I'm not just talking about what it can do, I'm talking about how much it impacts your system, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. But for now, the reason why people go through the hoops that this emulator gives us in terms of setup, it is a bit of a bitch to set up, but in terms of how much resources it takes on our hardware, is because of what it can do. It plays PlayStation 2 games, not just as well as it did on the console, but if you've got the system that can run it, it can completely blow the socks off it. I mean, games back then were kind of getting into the stage where they're very cinematic. I don't know, Metal Gear Solid franchise, for example, it looks absolutely beautiful. When you can then add the added extra effects that this emulator brings to you, such as enhanced resolution, 4K plus, anti-aliasing, post-processing shaders, mip-mapping, bilinear filtering, anisotropic filtering, texture filtering, widescreen hacks, so on and so forth. Games look like the current gen. It blows the socks off how the original PlayStation 2 looked. However, to get that kind of stuff, you're going to need a beast of a PC. Now, to run it natively, it says that on the official website, you're looking at a Pentium 4 with half a gig of RAM. Trust me, guys, you are not going to get much joy out of running that kind of setup. You are going to get games to probably boot, but you aren't going to get this kind of playability that you would expect. It says that it recommends an Intel Duo running at 3.2 gigahertz. That is kind of more sensible and along the way that you want to be looking at to get the minimum requirements, I would say, to get it playable. I would say you need a multi-core processor with as many gigahertz as possible. This favors Intel, but to be honest, when I was testing my 8350 AMD core back, well, a couple of years ago now, I was getting good stats out of that, but that's because it's clocked quite high, and that's what this emulator loves. It can take advantage of 3 cores, so it doesn't make any difference if you've got an i7, doesn't make any difference if you've got an i5. It would only take advantage of 3 cores, and only 2 of them are actually doing the grunt work which you would expect using threading. So even if you've got a 7-core system, or even further 7-core, even if you've got a multi-core system or even higher, it makes no difference. You're not going to get the kind of production that you would get normally having those kind of setups. What it can do is use 2 for processing the game, 1 to use the MTVU speed hack, which is only utilized in certain setups and games, but it does get the most out of your system. So having per grunt, per gigahertz, per core really enhances this. Certain games, of course, they're not very demanding. It all depends on what games you want to run. Not just because of how demanding they were as an actual game, especially the more 3D based ones with the InMotion engine, which was in the PlayStation 2. but I'm talking about in terms of compatibility as well. The emulator isn't 100% compatible. There's only 95% of the games that can run plus, I think, by now. The emulator is being developed, not just on a daily basis, but almost by the hour. So it is developing pretty quickly, and with the introduction of GitHub and the internet, and people are working together and working on this in a plug-in based system, yes, things are progressing a lot quicker than they were many years ago. But still, we're still hampered by some problematic games, so you're not going to play the entire library. And some of those games which are fully compatible still smash people's systems. I mean, if you're playing Shadow of Colossus, if you're playing Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid 2 with the Emotion engine, with the rain on the first level, it really smashes people's frames per second. You can use hacks, speed hacks and all that kind of stuff, but to be honest, if you've got a low-end system and you're struggling to play it in the first place, and you can manage to do it with a speed hack, so you can normally tell, because you're using frame skipping, things like that, it looks very glitchy and blocky, and yeah. Let's just face it, PSX2 is an awesome emulator, awesome, which is groundbreaking daily and adding new effects, new ideas, and pushing boundaries by the day, if not by the hour. But it does need a pretty beefy PC in order to get the most out of it. CPU to just run the game, a beefy GPU to then heighten the experience graphically. But let's not take that away from the emulator itself. If you've got a rig that can run this kind of emulator, then it's a masterpiece, and you can quote me on that. An absolute masterpiece of what can be done with emulation when people work together using a plug-in based system to emulate games which, to be honest, shouldn't run, but they do, and they run damn good. And of course, now you've got PlayStation 1 games booted on there. That's open another can of worms, but that's for another video. So thank you very much, PCSX2 guys. Thank you very much. So that just about wraps it up for part 1, guys. Now, we've got in depth, we have gone so detailed on this one, but that's how I want it to be. This is a special that I bring out annually, and I want to not just give you my top 10, anybody can do that. We can go and Google Watch Mojo, and there's 1,000 top 10s. There's probably about 10 emulator versions of that. However, on this one, we're giving informed feedback. I'm showing you not just what my top 10 is, but why I've chosen it. Why I've chosen it for that system, and while I've chosen it as an emulator altogether. There's a lot of information that is both misinformation and kept under wraps in this scene, and I'm trying my best to bring you all the information so you can make an informed decision of what you should be choosing, not just as an emulator, but for which emulator for which system also. So anyway, guys, enough for that. Look forward to the top 5. The link's in the description down below. That'll guide you straight there, and we can get amongst this, and you can see which one really is the best emulator of 2017. I'll see you there.